Hi, Sue. Sue Parker Hall. Welcome. And I'm gonna be asking you a little bit about some of the themes on the ceasefire method course. And you're really well placed. And actually, you were an inspiration for this work in many ways for me, because I went to one of your workshops years ago on anger and rage.
Oh,
and we became friends afterwards, didn't we?
yeah, absolutely. Ever since.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so maybe a good place to start is just to give us an idea of your background and your work and experience.
Oh, well, thank you so much for inviting me, Zach. And I think you're doing really important work that needs to be rolled out much more widely, and particularly raising awareness in therapists. Okay, a little bit about me. I qualified in '95. That was my basic qualification. Then I've done psychotherapy training since. I'm a transactional analyst, so I'm okay, you're okay, games people play, those kind of models. My first placement was in a training placement, which all counsellors have to do in training, was in a women's refuge. And as it is today, domestic abuse work was a multi-agency affair. And there were some men that weren't doing very well on the integrated domestic abuse programme, the British programme that's based on the Duluth model. They weren't really thriving on the model. So they got referred to me. And there were two interesting things that occurred to me. One is I noticed that when I did an intake and information taking, if I covered up the names and the sexes of the people, men and women all had early life trauma, all had early difficulties, very, very similar. So that was really interesting for me, that domestic abuse emerges out of a trauma field and only out of a trauma field. There's no other explanation for it in my book. So that I noticed. And the other thing I noticed is I then had to help the men debrief and process the trauma of having gone through the integrated domestic abuse programme, where it's a single cause, basically, that, you're sexist, you think badly of women, you want to control, instead of, there's about 12 other possible reasons why domestic abuse happens, all trauma related, but the model, and it's still true today, in the mainstream model's blind to trauma. So that's where I began. I was an enraged child. I wanted rage to be more compassionately understood. So that's my personal motivation. And then I wanted a human approach to rage, not a kind of political, radical feminist view of it, because I saw it as a human issue, not a male issue. And I've worked with a lot of men who've been on the receiving end of, I think, helping professionals contaminated by radical feminist thinking, who come from a starting point of men are bad, men are no good, men are dangerous, and really wanting to detox that. I mean, I do a little podcast called ManMaid, which it's about 33 episodes. They're only short. A little piece about an issue about men's disadvantage, basically, and then a little good guy of the week clip. So I'm quite passionate about undoing some of the damage that radical feminism's done in terms of how we perceive men, how we relate to men, how we work with men as therapists.
Thank you. And I don't want to go off into the rabbit hole here, but for people watching who might not know what we mean by radical feminism, can you give a kind of potted explanation?
I'll do my best. So relational feminists wanted equality, and now we do have equality. I'm convinced of that. There's enough legal measures in place for any woman who's discriminated against or treated wrongly to get a remedy. but what the radical feminists want, I think, is equity. So they want as many CEOs to be women as are men. They want as many MPs to be women as are men, etc., etc. So it's a kind of a social engineering. And they want more women in place because they don't think men are good, basically. They don't, men are not trusted. And there's more to it than that, Zach. I'm sorry, but
great, thank you. Okay, and
sorry, let me just say one more thing that I think might clarify and make it sound a bit more sensible.
Okay.
Old left-wing politics used to be working class, oppressor class. That shifted then to not oppressive class are the baddies, but men are the baddies. Once society became apparently a bit more equitable economically, then it shifted to bad men, good women. And there's a similar thing with the race issue, but just to kind of clarify.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's get into anger and rage. You wrote a book about this.
Yes, I've popped it on my shelf behind. Yeah.
Take us through your concepts.
Okay, so what I thought needed to be expressed was that anger and rage are very different phenomena. Traditionally, within psychology, you have anger at one end of a continuum and rage at the other. And so rage is just a stronger form of anger. But that just didn't add up for me. And if it is on a continuum, how do you work out where you are? How do you step back? So it became apparent to me that actually anger is quite a moderate state of arousal, and I describe it as a startle response. So, it's a startle response to something's happening in the environment that I need to address, that could be harmful. So I get into gear. I do what I need to do, and that might be to say no to somebody, or to say, back off, or I'm going to back off. It might be to kind of put my foot down and make a new decision about things. Things are not going to be like this anymore. They're going to be different. So it's a very useful utilitarian emotion. Whereas rage it's not an emotion at all. It's a trauma defense mechanism. And it's our earliest defense mechanism. I talk about hot rage as a cry for help. Now, this isn't to, condone any bad behaviour. It's not. People are responsible for their bad behaviour, but it is an explanation that it is a trauma symptom. And, what's really difficult for a lot of people to get their head around, especially practitioners, is that it's an unconscious one. People never, calculatedly, I don't believe, go into a rage. It's beyond their control, and they'll say that wasn't me, that didn't feel like me, and really it wasn't them. They've tumbled out of themselves into a universal coping strategy that any one of us can tip into at times in our lives when we're overloaded. And as adults, we often are overloaded. And we particularly fall into it if we haven't had the emotional care as little ones and children, if we haven't had the proper emotional care to learn how to identify the different processing emotions. I just limit it to anger, sadness, and fear, because I think that's enough for any of us to kind of get a good idea about it. If we've never had that emotional support to begin to differentiate out anger, sadness, and fear, which are the emotions that help us move through life, welcome experience, move on to the next bit of experience, then really anxiety, agitation, rage, or a more disconnecting, chilling, numbing, freezing kind of depression, they're the only options. And often people nip backwards and forwards between the two, get exhausted in the agitation and rage because it takes a lot of life force, and then tumble back down into depression.
It really resonates with me every time I hear you explain it.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well, there is no evidence base to my work. The only thing is if people resonate with it, find it useful.
And you do work with clients with it, and
yeah, I do.
Resonate with them.
Yes. Do you want to know the methodology? I can put it in a few sentences, or is there something more you'd like to talk about?
I think at this point, just to bring it back to make it really relevant to men, to fathers who are in a process of conflict with their ex-partners over the children, and maybe they haven't been able to see their children for a while, or maybe their contact has been reduced.
Yes.
And just to link that to what you said about feeling overwhelmed as adults, not being able to cope, and either getting agitated and anxious or dropping into numbing out.
Yeah.
So I just want to contextualize that, because that is where a lot of these men are, and it's so difficult to remain clear about what we are feeling, and to stay aware and not make poor decisions. And so when someone tips over into rage, you described it as our earliest defense mechanism. Can you say a little bit more about what's going on in terms of neurobiology and the nervous system and things like that, just so we can understand why it's really impossible to make good decisions from that place?
Well, the first and main thing is it's a pre-verbal, precognitive state. You know, when we're in a rage, our best thinking, frontal cortex, decision making, reality checking, solution finding part of our brain gets knocked offline, and we're at the mercy of more kind of base primitive forces, you know, in the lower brain and the mammalian brain. And our autonomic nervous system is overwrought. You know, our organism is full to the brim of things that we haven't been able to process and come to terms with, full to the brim of pain, basically. It all gets kind of melded together in pain. And, you know, one more thing that requires the resource that we haven't got because we're so overwhelmed, and it can be such a tiny thing, can lead to explosion or to just shutting down and withdrawing. Is that enough? Is that enough for that?
Yeah, thank you.
And just, I can't reiterate enough, it's a trauma symptom. It only happens to traumatized people. So we ought to be compassionate, and we ought to be helping people address the trauma.
And actually what happens often, which you alluded to in the beginning, is on modern day perpetrator prevention what they called IPP, domestic violence perpetrator programs, EVPP courses, which are recommended by CAFCAS often in family court settings, and they're accredited by Respect, and they're similar to what you were describing, that the man is the perpetrator, and in order to get onto the course he has to say, yeah, there's something wrong with me, I'm a perpetrator, and to complete the course he has to go along with this one size fits all most of the time process. It can go on for 26 weeks or 32 weeks.
That's right.
And there's not a lot of room, or not any room, for a compassionate understanding of the trauma history. And what do we mean by trauma and trauma history?
Okay, so I think it's firstly developmental, so not the emotional care, because parents haven't had the emotional care themselves. It's not that parents withhold any goodness that they've got, but I always say parents do their best. They absolutely do their best. No parent really gets up in the morning and thinks, I won't do my best today. So, and I think each successive generation parents better than the last. We learn, we grow. I'm sorry, Zach, I've forgotten your question.
Just to define what trauma is, and you said it's developmental often.
So if we haven't developed those processing emotions, life just hits us. It's like a blow, one experience after another, blow, 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 lodged in our bodies until we get to a point where we can't cope anymore. And I talk about trauma as an untold story. So it's something that's happened to me that I haven't been able to get over, come to terms with. And they all meld together, as I said, and overwhelm us.
So this is relevant for everyone, not just the men.
No.
This is part of the story of what's happening with their ex-partners, and maybe can help us understand, why is she completely ignoring everything we're doing to try and solve the problem? We both share a child or children, and it's pretty obvious that the children need contact with both parents. So how can someone, most of the time the mother, but not always, but how can that person, how can we understand what they're doing if they're completely blocking contact?
Yes.
I think this understanding of trauma and rage is a way of understanding that there's something going on in that person. And you said there's hot and cold rage. Or maybe the hot rage is being shown in allegations of abuse, and all sorts of allegations happen. It's kind of normal now, often. And maybe in the cold rage, the withholding is just never responding to any messages. Just not cooperating at all.
I think that's a really good analysis. And I think there is a kind of splitting going on. Someone's good, someone's bad, which is, like the radical feminist theory. Someone's good, someone's bad. This has gone offline because, again, that splitting, you're either shit or you're fine, you're good or you're bad, is again our earliest way of experiencing the world. So it's a really regressed young state that we go into when we're in survival mode. There isn't any what transactional analysts would call the adult ego state. They're coming from their child when they're in rage. They either fight or flee.
Thank you.
So again, the good thinking, problem solving, agreeable, negotiating, able has gone offline.
And there is a game being played, isn't there? Maybe just say a little bit about that. So with there's an adult ego state, and then there's a a parent and a child ego
Mhm.
state, and
Mhm.
we can kind of flip into from child to parent and critical parent to vulnerable child.
Mhm.
And that's often how it feels for a lot of these fathers in this process, is that they're being told off by a critical parent.
Yes.
And that's backed up by institutions. Often it feels like it is. I mean, whether or not there is explicit systemic sexism in the system is another question we don't really need to go into, but the
Mhm.
experience of being a father, just applying through rational, just asking for the opportunity to see a child and then not being
Yeah.
given it. So going to court to present the case and then being subject to a really traumatic, shocking experience where it's very difficult to get to be heard, which is maybe what it can feel like as a child who's not being listened to and is being criticized.
You're right about the parent child. Not wanting to complicate it, but hoping to explain it a bit more. In our child ego state, there is a parent that we've taken on board. There's a child that lived through what we lived through, and there's either no or very little adult ego state in there. We're little adults from about 2. We're adults in embryo from about 2. When we begin to differentiate, separate, I'm me, you're you, we're different, that's an opportunity for the parent in the child to really grow that little adult, give them lots of permissions where they feel they can have an impact, or they can choose, decide, they can, obviously they need some no's as well, but they need a lot of yeses. So the parent child that you're talking about, Zach, is all in the child ego state. It's the little parent, and it's the, that's been integrated from the real parent, if you see what I mean.
It's such an interesting conversation, because I really want to go off now on a tangent into masculine archetypes and how this is a good segue into what we wanted to talk about, which is shame.
Yeah.
I had the realization recently that the masculine archetypes of fighting and winning, providing and protecting, and mastery of emotions. And what I mean by masculine archetypes, I've got to remember that this is a video for people who don't know anything about psychology, and why would they? But these are quite simple concepts, actually. There's this idea that there's base structures in the masculine psyche that are adaptive. They come from our evolution, from our primordial past, and they result in types of behavior that we see across all cultures and all times and locations, which masculinity has to be demonstrated, to be proven in certain behaviors, and they are to do with hunting and protecting and detaching from emotion sometimes. And so this can make for a really lethal cocktail for men going through the family court process and being estranged from their children, because when a man feels as though he can't win, when he's going to court to fight for what's right, his child needs a relationship with him, but the other side has all the guns. He doesn't have. He's got his hands tied behind his back, so he can't win. I mean, he really can't win.
No.
It's not an exaggeration to say that.
No.
So he's then left with whatever happens to him. He might lose a lot of money. He might lose his job if he's got to focus on the court case for years. And so his ability to provide is maybe taken away or damaged, and he hasn't won the fight. So that's going to bring up shame, probably. And he may be finding it difficult to be chipper, you know, in the classic traditional masculine way of just stiff up a bit.
Yeah.
You know, we all get to a point where it's all too much.
Yeah, absolutely. That mastery of emotion isn't possible anymore. And everything that gives you self-esteem, you know, being a parent, good parent, being a provider, being a protector, you know, fighting and women. Sorry, fighting and winning. That's so funny. Fighting and winning. It's a devastating blow to identity, isn't it?
So can you map out some of the links there between shame and rage?
Okay. The two coexist. You don't have one without the other. I think there's a hot shame and a cold shame. So a hot shame is like, you know, when the face is burning, it's really public, it's really obvious, and people will often tip into rage when they touch that, because it's such a very vulnerable, risky, dangerous, humiliating state to be in. So you can tip into hot rage. The other one is you probably notice somebody go quite white or deadened, flat energy, all the life force is gone, more of a kind of flop state, and that's a kind of cold shame. Again, shame is a trauma symptom. So my way of describing it is, the first impact of a trauma is to feel bad. And what happens then, if there's nobody there to help us realize that something bad happened to us, if there's nobody there to help us, we feel bad and we think we're bad. We get confused. So we feel bad and think we're bad, and we can stay in there for decades, you know, if there's not somebody to help us out. And some of the men that you're working with and that I've been working with have been told they're bad by agencies, partners, other people, domestic abuse facilitators. Over again, it's affirming the shame. It's not looking at the pain. You know, it's not looking at the pain. Shame, again, trauma symptom, unconscious, can't control it. Rage, unconscious, can't control it. The only way we can work with it is to look at, come on, let's help you emotionally process things. Let's affirm your suffering, kindness, compassion. You know, it's a wretched experience. It's a bloody wretched experience. You know, let's help you. Let's help you settle, and then you settle yourself and get your best head on and know that you're okay. So,
yeah. It's really bringing some stuff up.
Right. It's relentless for some men in the system. The shaming is relentless. It's brutal.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard for therapists to sit with the unfairness of it all, the injustice of it all.
I think
hard for therapists
exactly.
to sit.
Just hearing you describe it all so eloquently again, really, it's difficult. what I've seen. Yeah, what I've seen among my clients. And I'm thinking of one man in particular I just had a one-off session with last week, and I don't think he was in a place to start working with me, but he was, yeah, just the look on his face at the end. Okay, so maybe, I know we're going to close shortly, but could you say just for a few moments,
sure,
a little bit about, okay, so you mapped out the theory. How can people actually start working through this stuff? What does that look like?
I don't think you can do it on your own. Pierre Janet, part of his definition of trauma is there was nobody there. There was nobody there that could help. And I don't think we can do it on our own. I think we do need at least one other, if not a kind of fellowship, of people who understand that it's trauma that causes this. It's not that somebody's willfully bad, or power crazy, or just wants to manipulate women, or it's got to be a trauma response. It's got to be help to talk about the suffering. And I'm sure you find exactly the same. We have to talk about the current suffering, before we can get anywhere near, what's led up to this. So it's a lot of kind of listening and talking, helping people put language to the pain, to be able to verbalize what's made them sad, what makes them angry, like what's not fair, galvanize that energy to protect themselves and their child, and to grieve as well. To feel sorry for the self, which I think is quite hard to do, but to feel sorry for the self that so much pain has been caused.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sue.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It really is my pleasure.
Really, it's such a rich body of work that you've developed, and to hear you again, I've heard you do this many times, but every time when I hear you describe it, it's so coherent to me and rings true.
And we've had some wonderful conversations on the other half, haven't we, on our Facebook page that we share. I really love discussing these things with you, Zach, what you bring as well.
Great. I'm going to end the recording. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.